Hey there. I want to just make a quick follow-up video to the first, I guess, behind the screen video that I did to kind of not leave you hanging and showed you what I all found as a bit of a solution. And also because I kind of understand what's going on here a bit more. So let me start here at the beginning. So this is the core.asm. This is where the core of our battle engine lies. And this is main in battle loop. This is where you start just at the start of each round. So I'm going to go down here. I'm just going to highlight some little important bits. So we go down here, and I'm looking for... Here we go. Display battle menu. This is where your battle menu is shown. And if we go down a bit in operations, we see bit using trapping move. And what does this do? Well, if the menu comes up and the player is under the effect of a trapping move, well, it's going to load our null value FF into the player's selected move. So even from the very start of the menu, we're already messing around with the move that a player has supposedly selected. The idea here is that if the player is under the effect of a trapping move, well, you don't want to let the player select a move. But moving on, just keep that in mind that this is already happening. We go down to select player move here. Let's say it's not a trapping move. The player's allowed to select a move. You go to choose fight, and you have call move selection menu. This is where the player is actually selecting a move to put within the player selected move WRAM location. So this happens right up here. And then what's the very next thing that happens? The enemy gets to select a move. So it doesn't matter if it's a link cable battle or a wild battle or a trainer AI battle. The way it's coded when you're playing it on your Game Boy is that the player selects the move and then it handles selecting the enemy move. So this will fill in WRAM address enemy selected move. Let's go down more, because once that's chosen, right? Oh, keep in mind, if you don't, if the player does not select a move, what about using an item and switching? Where does that happen? Well, using an item and switching happens way up at the top where you display battle menu. So instead of choosing to fight, you chose use an item, or you chose to run, or you chose to switch. That happens way up here before you even select, before the player even selects a move. So, first thing that happens in sequence, use item or player can use an item or run, or first thing that happens in sequence, a player can use an item or switch. Next thing in sequence, player chooses move if applicable. Next thing in sequence, the enemy can select a move. Then it decides who goes first in the round. We check priorities, we check speeds, right? Let's say the enemy moves first. we call this trainer AI function across banks. We've already done the move selection for the enemy. So what does this do? Well, this handles, is the enemy going to use an item or switch? So the next thing in sequence, if the enemy moves first, the enemy is allowed to use an item or switch, even after it's made a move selection. That's just how the sequence works. And then, if applicable, execute the enemy move. And then, if applicable, execute the player move. What if the player moves first? Well, you still call the trainer AI. The enemy still has the opportunity to switch or use an item. I set an enemy acted bit right here to record that. That fixes an issue where in the original games, opponent trainers could use items in the wrong sequence. But look at this. If the player moves first, the trainer AI is allowed to use an item or switch. It has that opportunity. Then execute the player move if applicable. And then execute the enemy move if applicable. So, in review, player has the opportunity to use an item or switch. Then player may select a move if applicable. Then enemy gets to select a move. Then enemy gets to use an item, gets an opportunity to use an item or switch. And then, depending on who is faster, execute player move and enemy move. So that is how the sequence is handled. Why is this important? I'm going to look up, find a recent file. Trainer AI. What happens when an enemy switches? I'm gonna search for some stuff. Switch enemy mon. So this handles switching. It doesn't matter if it's an AI opponent or a link cable battle. This is the code that handles the opponent switching. Here we have if the player is using a trapping move and the enemy switches, this is A XORed with A, which always results in 0. So we'll load 0 into player number attacks left. And then we'll load our null value of FF into player selected move. So when this happens, according to the established sequence, the player has made their move selection, and this is overriding the player's move selection with a null value. So this will deny a player its move if the opponent switches out of a trapping move. That's working as intended. But what happens when it's reversed and you have the enemy using a trapping move and the player switches out? So for that, look up selected move. Here we go. Switch player mon. This is where the code that handles the player switching. So, if the enemy is using a trapping move and the player switches, we set the enemy number of attacks left to 0, XOR A with itself, and then load A's value into here. Then we load our null move of FF into enemy selected move. But we have to do something extra here. And I'm going to explain this. So let's assume that we don't do this. Just ignore this little bit for a second here. Say, cover that up with your thumb. Pretend it's not there. So here you've overwritten the enemy selected move when the player does a switch. But that's like the first thing that happens in sequence. So what's happening when you hit the third order of sequence and the enemy is selecting a move? All right, we get here, select enemy move, this function here. We go through this, da 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 da, blah blah blah. Right. We do all this stuff. You know, we randomly choose one of the 4 moves with a whole bunch of weights and yada yada yada. You know, we do some PP tracking that I added in there. Some stuff for broken things. Okay, done. We are done selecting a move. Oh, look. We put the selected move's value that was decided by all this code up here in an enemy selected move, overriding the FF null value that I put that was put in there by the player switching. Well, then how do trapping moves work, right? Why is it that say the enemy doesn't switch? If the enemy doesn't switch, why is it that the player can use a trapping move and deny the enemy using a move? Right? Well, that's due to this code up here a little ways in the same function. We check to see if the player is using a trapping move on the enemy. And if it's not, the enemy is allowed to select a move. But if the player is using a trapping move, we do some stuff that I added for the AI, but I load the FF null value into the A register and then go to done, and that gets loaded into enemy selected move, right? Hey, a trapping move's being used on the enemy. Give the enemy the null move so that it's not allowed to use an attack, any kind of move. So here's what I needed to do in order to fix it. So if I go up here, just above where I do the check of is the player using a trapping move, I took an unused bit 2, and in the WRAM file, I defined it here, bit 2. If set, the AI can switch or use an item, but not use a move. And this was originally so that I could run AI move choosing routines and only have it really apply to routine 4, which is switching. But I'm also going to use this for the second intended purpose. So what I do here is I point the HL register to this WRAM address that I'm using. I check the status of bit 2, and then I reset it. The reset command actually doesn't change your test flags or your checks, or I don't know what kind of flags you call them, like your compare flags. Reset, like this is valid. Reset doesn't mess with the results of this. All this does is set some compare flags so you can see if bit 2 is set. So I'll check bit 2, I'll reset it to 0, and then if bit 2 was set when I checked it up here, that tells me, hey, that bit was set. I don't want the enemy to be able to choose a move, which then jumps down to here, which is exactly what would happen if the enemy was caught in the midst of a trapping move, right? We load that null value into A, we jump down to done, it gets loaded into enemy selected move. And when does that bit get set? I can go back a little bit. Remember that thing I told you to ignore? It's now relevant. Not here, not here. I'm looking for the wrong thing. Here we go. When should that bit be set? Because I've taken account that weird little asymmetric sequence. When the player switches, I need to set that bit along with this other stuff. And then when the enemy's selecting a move, it'll see that bit, it'll reset it back to 0, and that will prevent the enemy from selecting a move if the player switches out of a trapping move. And that's how I fixed it.